Okay, so in this video, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about two of the keywords essays that were assigned. You had a third reading, selections from how racism takes place, but I will talk about that in the third and final video for week 2. What I want to do is spend a little bit of time right now talking about the two essays, Race by George Lipsitz and Race by Trisha Keaton. Those were assigned to give you a more in-depth understanding from two kind of well-known scholars in their fields of both of those concepts, since they really frame a lot of what we're going to be looking at and discussing this semester. Actually, one of the words comes from Keywords for American Cultural Studies, but the other one comes from a related book called Keywords for African American Studies. If you're not familiar, if this kind of stuff interests you, it's a really great series that NYU put out where they have these keywords essays for, media studies, Asian American studies, African American studies, cultural studies, that really brings together all these different scholars from across the world to kind of really hone in on the history and the way that we use and understand certain concepts. So I always like to start my classes with some of these because I think it gives us a good framework. I talked about this class as a class that focuses on race and space, blackness and space in particular. So I figured we really need to talk about what we mean by space. And you all had some really phenomenal responses for week 1 when you thought about, the relationship between race and space. I remember one of you brought up that, separately, these words kind of mean very different things often, but when you put them together, they have such a unique and specific history and meaning, which is very true. In this case, George Lipsitz, who is a sociologist, also kind of an interdisciplinary scholar, focuses on space through the lens of cultural geography. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the third and final video because both him and Catherine McKittrick really use cultural geography as a framework for talking about space. But I really just want to get at, what do we mean when we talk about space, and why is this course on current community problems or, kind of African American issues? Why is this focusing on race and space? So kind of one of Lipsitz's famous lines is, in order for history to take place, it takes places, right? And it's true. If you think about it, we all know kind of certain histories like colonization, Western expansion, segregation, and we know the history of some of these kind of big issues, but we often don't think about the role that space played in those. Even if you think about, medieval history and the Crusades, it's all about space, right? It's about people vying for space and the meaning tied to that space, right? Trying to make the space, in the case of the Crusades, these so-called, Christendom, right? This Christian kingdom that expands across this large space, or alternatively, claiming a large space for Islam, right? So it's interesting to think that even historically, before we come to the US, we are often thinking about cultural and political and economic power as it relates to space. And so I think, we know this. If you, really talk about it, you're like, oh yeah, duh, that makes sense. But Lipsitz and a lot of what other cultural geographers and sociologists do is really walk us through the ways in which that takes place. So one of the things I thought that comes out of that essay that I want you to take a moment is to really, pause. And when I say things like the frontier, right, if you close your eyes, what comes to mind for you, right? I won't do the Google litmus test thing, but it might be images of, covered wagons and horses, or people, fending off a wild beast while they're trying to carve out and establish a new town. Or if I talk about Western expansion, right? It might carve out, depending on your history and what you have learned or discussed, images of fights with native populations and of violence and genocide, right? It really depends on where you're from and what histories you're looking at. But those are spaces that when just the word, the frontier, or the Wild West come to mind, there are very particular images, people, histories that also come with those, right? Same thing happens if I say something like the hood or the ghetto or the streets. You're likely to get certain images in your mind, right? And that's in particular is what this course is about. You'll see here I have a picture from Boys in the Hood, which I'm hoping, I need to see if we have access to it, that I'm hoping that'll be one of the films that we look at together. But again, very particular images, people, beliefs, behaviors that we assign to those spaces. And that goes same thing if I talk about the suburbs or the res or, the barrio, you are going to have very different conceptions of the way those spaces are viewed, who belongs in those spaces, right? Who doesn't belong, and what class are the people in those spaces? What jobs do they hold? What languages do they speak? How much power do they hold? These are questions that, we need to really ask and interrogate when we think of very particular spaces. And so what George Lipsitz is really getting at in that essay is that there is a whole host of relationships and histories tied to space that we don't often think about when we just look at it through the pure lens of geography, right? He goes through some of the history of how that happened, and he makes the claim that this has always been the case, especially in the US, right? Even when you think about kind of the language of the New World and coming to colonize over here, the early colonialists, they came here to create what they saw as a free space, right? A space that was free from the corruption they saw or they perceived of European political powers, religiously free space, right? So for them, it was a space of purity, of freedom, of escape. But then Lipsitz points out the interesting kind of dynamic that that's very same space, right, meant something very different for other people. So where the quote unquote New World was a space of freedom, of purity, of, a religious expression for the people who came over here and colonized, for people who were brought over here enslaved or for indigenous people here, it became a space of unfreedom, right? Of violence, of suffering. All, meeting at the very same point, the very same history had, and the very same space has these competing meanings for folks. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit with McKittrick when we talk about her in the next video. So one of the big takeaways I want you to have is that Lipsitz points to the fact that a single space can have these competing identities or histories or perceptions depending on where you come from, right? So the same space, let's take the West or the frontier, will mean something very different to, for example, white Americans who were coming out and seeing that as a space to be tamed than it did for indigenous people or, in the case of the Southwest, people of Mexican descent who that was their country and then all of a sudden it wasn't, right? So that same space can have very different meanings for different people. The other thing he's getting at, and he talks a lot, and I'll get to this on the next page, is this question of spatial imaginary and how we picture space. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's tied to these two concepts that you see on the screen, particularly when we're looking at the space of the US, and even in the very beginning, before we became a nation, when we were still a colony, right? Space itself was fundamental to the way we defined ourselves, right? And I'm using the royal we here, right? Knowing that we all have different histories and relationships to this country. But if you've heard of something like settler colonialism, that term, which really have the definition up here, but really it's different from other forms of colonialism where you had kind of a power just standing there and you took resources from it, right? Settler colonialism is when you actually move into the space and you attempt to create a whole different culture and identity in that space, right? The US is a prime example of that. Australia, South Africa, those are some of the ones, Canada, that come up, as opposed to originally other colonies were intended to just be, they kept very clear, they were Spanish or they were this or they were, Portuguese, and the colony was not was a colony and not meant to be its own identity, its own nation, its own new culture. So that idea of taking a space and making it something new and creating a whole new set of meanings was fundamental to kind of the very experience of the people who came here to make this into a colony and then a nation. When we talk about the freedom and the way that space was seen by certain people in power, right? Manifest destiny, which you've all probably learned about before, which is the ideology that, the people who colonized or came here had a God-given right, or it was their destiny, to go on and to conquer the land and to turn it into something new, right? Again, to turn it into this free, pure, incorrupt space. These are ideas that are fundamental to kind of the base identity of the U.S., and they are strictly tied to the taming and the making of spaces, right? Of giving a meaning to the space of what is now the U.S. in and of itself. So what Lipsis is getting at, and I know it's a lot to kind of work through the essays, is he just wants you to understand that space is tied to kind of moral ideas, right? So he talked about the history of the U.S., and he also mentioned some other histories, but particularly in the U.S., the moral kind of virtues associated with different spaces of being pure, of being a space of freedom, incorrupt. But then on the flip side, he points out that that wasn't true for other people inhabiting the very same space, right? So it wasn't a pure free space for indigenous folks or enslaved people of African descent. So it's interesting to think about kind of those different experiences within the same space. The other main thing from the space essay is this term spatial imaginary, and I want to make sure that you feel somewhat comfortable with it, because that's something that we'll be using to a degree throughout the course, right? You'll hear me talk about like the white imaginary or the black imaginary, right? And all that really gets at is just the way that we define, imagine, or give meaning to particular spaces. So everything I just talked about in terms of the way, the West or the early colonies were envisioned and the kind of moral senses that were associated with those spaces, that means that they had, they occupied kind of this particular identity in the wider spatial imaginary, right? So now kind of what we tend to think about when we're looking at the US and development over time are what we call the white spatial imaginary, or the way from like a white perspective, certain spaces are seen, are understood, the meanings associated with those spaces, as well as, the way certain spaces themselves are seen as white. And then we'll talk about the black spatial imaginary, right? I'm going to read you this quote because I think I'm trying to pull out for you some of the kind of key aspects from this essay. And he says this about the white spatial imaginary, and I want to make sure you kind of capture this. The white spatial imaginary tells people of color that they belong somewhere else, that you are what you are in part because you originate from a certain kind of space, and that that space has those properties in part, I should say in part, because it is inhabited by creatures like yourself. So he's getting at this idea that, again, it's this kind of circular thing, that a space gets its meaning because of the people who live there, but that the people who live there have a certain identity or meaning associated with them because of where they come from. So let me give you an example. Historically, if you're familiar with philosophers like Hegel, for example, really well known, made some significant contributions in certain things, but he's also known for this kind of famous line of saying Africa is a place with no history, right, or no culture. He really defined Africa as kind of really like this pre-civilized space where mankind was in its most kind of primal, version of itself. And so that became his thesis, his idea became a fundamental way that Europeans saw Africans, right? Like they didn't really have history, they didn't really have culture, and because of that, that was a way to justify enslaving them and then bringing them to the US and not really feeling too bad that they lost their language, their culture, whatever. If it didn't have that meaning because they came from a place with no history or no culture, that meant that you could see them differently and treat them differently by bringing them to Europe and to the colonies. So that's one example of how where someone's from, translates to the way that they're perceived and then the way that they exist in different spaces. Let me give you another example, something that's going to be really tied to this class and it maybe resonates with you all. So let's say as a Black person, I grew up and I'm going to give you the Midwest because that's where I'm from. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and it's interesting because even if you're not from Chicago, almost everyone in the US knows what I'm signifying when I say the south side of Chicago. The things that come to mind are poor, Black, urban, right? So those are the meanings and the things that get associated with me if I say I'm from there. When I move, or let's say I go into, the University of Chicago, or come to NYU, or I go to some of these more spaces that are seen as highly educated, not really Black spaces, let's say, right? I will be seen very differently once I tell people I'm from the south side of Chicago, right? So where someone's from is tied to, it shapes the way that they are perceived with certain behaviors, right? Because that space in and of itself gets assigned a certain kind of meaning. So the way that we imagine these spaces from different perspectives is what he's really getting at when he says the spatial imaginary. When he says the white spatial imaginary, he means from kind of like a dominant white perspective, the way that different spaces are imagined. It's not just white space, but the way the suburbs are imagined from a white spatial imaginary. And again, I'm using broad strokes of like dominant views, not every single white person, but these dominant patterns. The suburbs are viewed as a safe space, right? A space where you raise families, things like that. The city, in particular, spaces like, south side of Chicago, would be seen as violent and dangerous and things like that, right? So that would be the way that those two spaces exist in a white spatial imaginary. On the flip side, in the Black spatial imaginary, he talks a lot about how, yes, there's an awareness and an understanding of those spaces and their histories, but there's also an effort to use the Black spatial imaginary to kind of counter some of those representations and meanings. So, for example, Black space, let's keep using the south side of Chicago as an example, might be envisioned as, yes, there might be certain threats or lacks of opportunities, but it also can be imagined as a space of community, right? A place where you have family and friends who support you, a place where you can work hard and get your education, a place where, you can persist, right? Not denying the reality of all those things around you, but to say that it's not just this one-dimensional kind of oppressive space, but there's also joy and community and life in that space as well. And so he talks a lot about the Black spatial imaginary in particular as a place where people kind of resist the way that they're being defined by others. I may have questions on all of this, so if you do, feel free to send me an email. The big kind of takeaway from the space essay is just know this, okay? So maybe if I can circle back, because I know it's a lot. Space isn't just physical, and I'm going to say this again in the next video as well, that it is a set of, moral, cultural, political, economic meanings tied to both the space itself and the people who live in or come from those spaces. That's the first thing. The second thing to note is that these spaces aren't kind of static, right? But that they're dynamic, that people are constantly kind of fighting over or contesting through culture, through other ways to define or redefine the space and themselves. And a really good example of that is a lot of what we're going to do in this class is look at the way that Black Americans have used music and television and literature to define both kind of the realities of some of the issues they're facing, as well as redefine the way they are seen in negative ways as people who live in these kind of, segregated spaces. So that's the big takeaway from that essay. The next thing I want to talk about is the race essay by Trisha Keaton. So, we talked a little bit about race in the lecture video for today, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over kind of like race in general. I wanted to circle back. I had hinted to you and talked a little bit about the history of race, and Keaton really gets into that. and talks about, in general, again, there's no universal definition. If you ask someone on the street, if you did a survey, if you went out, you're going to get very different answers from very different people. But there are scholars and fields and people who study this for a living and look at the way that race has operated historically to come to kind of a definition understanding. And part of that is knowing that originally race kind of emerged as this perception of like a science, which is very false. But there was this belief, and there's this quote that she has where she says, race is biology and biology is destiny, right? And that understanding of race shaped a large part of history in the US, right? So I have this image here that you can kind of see. There's this whole history of people who did phrenology, and they would measure skulls, and they really thought that this was a science of like, there's a spectrum of what they called the Negroid to the Mongoloid to, the Anglo-Saxon, and they would categorize different races of people and, talked about their physical and their emotional and their intellectual attributes. And this started again in Europe, but it very much was perfected here. And even one of you mentioned, Thomas Jefferson in that essay that you read from the 1619 Project. They mentioned Jefferson and his history with slaves. He wrote some very interesting discussions of people of African descent where he again uses quote unquote science to talk about like the predetermined nature of blackness and why black people are more predisposed to be slaves than others. Ironically, he also talked about how no one could find black people beautiful, but yet, as we know, he had several children with his black slave. So I always love that bit of contradiction in some of our history. Anyway, know that race kind of was first seen as this kind of scientific thing, but has absolutely nothing to do with biology, right? It was used that way to justify things, but over time, when people kind of started playing by that game and saying, okay, I mentioned the US v. Thind, right? The Indian man who was like, okay, fine, if you want to say race is this, scientific thing and that people who are white are descendant of Aryan people, well, he traced back his lineage and was like, look, I can prove that I'm also a descendant of these people. Can I legally be white? Because that's what it took for him to be able to own land and be a citizen and things like that. Well, that was a court case in 1932 where they said, actually, just kidding, it's not science, it's the common sense understanding of whiteness, right? Which goes to show kind of the very fluid way that race, was understood, and how over time people began to really recognize it as not just science, but really this social and political category. I'll come back to why there's some confusion about biology and the role in that. But I want to point to something that Keaton gets at, is that even today, when we can all kind of acknowledge and say, yeah, race is a social construction, there's still kind of these weird ways that this narrative of biology shows up. And one of the primary examples, I want to show this to you, but I won't for sake of time. But there's this video, it was an Ancestry.com commercial. And it's this woman pictured here. And she, if you've seen the commercial, she goes through and she says, I always thought that I was Hispanic. And then I did my DNA test and I found out that I'm actually from all over. And then they have these quantifiable percentages where she says she's, Native American and Spanish and African and Middle Eastern, which is hilarious because race is not biological. And if you understand, for example, the way that Hispanic or Latinx came to be terms in the West, this came out of history of colonization and the merging of indigenous, Spanish, people of African descent, and there's Middle Eastern heritage as well if you know the history of Spain, right? And people who came over also from other European countries and mixed in. So to be quote unquote Hispanic or Latinx is this kind of, it's used in society as a racial category, even though it's not, because there are people who are black and white and brown that are all Latinx, but that's a whole nother conversation. But Ancestry DNA becomes this kind of new way that people are quantifying their race, so to speak, instead of really what they're talking about here is, maybe, where their ancestors came from, but the way that we try to quantify that in DNA really pushes these boundaries of what we're trying to say race really is. This is the confusing part, because some of you might say, well, but you can use DNA to trace certain characteristics and things like that. And Keaton gets into this, and I think that she does a really good job of explaining that yes, there is a relationship between race and environment, right? So physically, socially, culturally, but this is all socially, constructed. So for example, medicine, people might talk about certain things that are more common amongst certain groups, like, amongst Black Americans, certain diseases are more common. Well, some of that, as Keaton talks about, has to do with social and economic conditions, right? The history of housing segregation often put Black neighborhoods in places where there were more environmental hazards, right? Or where there's higher concentrations of poverty, less access to healthy foods, higher rates of infestation and asbestos and other things that had these negative impacts on people's health. So then the relationship that we see between race, or Blackness in this case, and particular diseases or health conditions comes out of these social and political and economic kind of forces, not something in your DNA that says, oh, you have this amount of, color in your skin, so that means these are the diseases you're going to get. The other thing that kind of confuses folks is the way that certain facial or biological features are tied to the way we've evolved in certain places over time. So yes, there might be certain things that are more prominent of people of, there are certain things, for example, that are more prominent people of Ethiopian descent, right? Or people of, Arab descent, right? But that's because we're looking at people groups that have evolved over long periods of time in particular environmental conditions, so their bodies have adjusted over generations to have certain traits. Has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that you are that color and therefore you have this mental or physical abilities or strengths or the values we assign. It's really about the values we assign to particular groups based off of what they look like. That's the part that is artificial, right? There's nothing in your DNA sequence or the color of your skin that says you're more of an athlete or a dancer or this or that. There is, we all joke about it, about, for example, Black people dancing or being better at certain sports. But culturally, if that becomes a dominant ideology, then that becomes a social determinant that people begin to live into, right? But you will find people who are good and bad at sports and dancing and math and every single race across the world, right? But the way that we see it as normative or not is really the issue of race. So the big takeaway from Keaton's essay, and I think one of the most important aspects for this course, is that we move beyond this idea of just saying, yes, race is socially constructed, so what, right? I think you all probably would not be taking this course if you thought this way, but for a while, people took this idea and said, well, if it's socially constructed, then that means we can kind of choose to just ignore it or, pretend it's not there and we'll get past it, right? Let's just be colorblind. And, that maybe came out of a good place, but what Keaton points at is race has a material life. I'm going to read this quote here where she says, race and racism are not mere social constructs, but political, lived, and at times deadly experiences that play a fundamental and intersectional role in the everyday because they are deeply ingrained in our social institutions, ranging from family to education to economics to law. A lot of you mentioned in your comments how we see that, today, current issues. You're watching the news, you're seeing what's going on. I'm watching it with you, right? I'm living it, right? I don't live that far from where George Floyd was murdered. You all have seen a lot of things. You saw over the weekend people mourning the death of Black Panther, right? So it's interesting to think about what has meaning to folks, right? Yes, it's socially constructed, but the consequences and the implications are very tangible and real. And that's a lot of what we're going to be exploring in the rest of this course. So those are the big takeaways from those 2 essays. If you have questions, let me know. Again, I think a lot of this would be good office hour conversations, but I can do my best to try to answer you via email as well.